Good morning, beautiful children. We are nearing the end of this very fascinating book, Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. Today's chapter is called The Doctor. Well, let's think about what happened yesterday. Yesterday, we found out that the rats had to move very quickly because the scientists and the exterminators were coming. We found out that Mrs. Frisby went to a meeting and learned a little bit more about those rats of NIMH and how they had planned to get out um, of the rose bush and where they were going to go. When they found out that they had to move so quickly, some of them stayed behind as a diversion. I'm wondering what happened to those rats that stayed behind. It looks fairly dark right now for them, but we will see. Okay, this is the last chapter before the epilogue. It is called The Doctor. Now, the next morning, Mr. Fitzgibbon started the larger of his two tractors, the huge one that he kept in the barn, the one that pulled the combine in the fall harvest. With help from Paul and Billy, he bolted the big bulldozer blade to the front of it, rumbled it up through the barnyard gate, and stopped it right near the rose bush. "We'll wait until they come," he said, turning off the engine. Mrs. Frisby could not bear to watch, and yet even more she could not bear not to watch. She knew there was nothing to be gained by it, nothing that she could do at all. Yet how could she stay at home when 10 rats, including Justin and Brutus, were waiting bravely underground? Oh my, she could not. She thought at first of her watch hole in the corner post. Then she decided against it. Near to the rosebush on the edge of the woods stood a hickory tree, its scaly bark like a ladder inviting her to climb. 10 feet up on the tree a large branch jutted straight out. On the branch, up close to the trunk, she had a vantage point from which, herself unseen, she could look down on the rosebush and also see what was going on in the woods to the blackberry bramble, where, though she had never been in it, she was sure the rats' rear exit must be hidden. She settled down to wait. It was a very chilly morning, with a damp breeze and a gray mist that blew by in patches. Somewhere near the middle of the morning, a square white truck came into the driveway. It went first to the house. A man in a white coverall uniform climbed out and knocked on the Fitzgibbons' door. It was too far away for Mrs. Frisby to hear the knock or to hear what the man said when Mrs. Fitzgibbons came out on the porch. But 10 seconds later Billy ran from the house to the barn where Mr. Fitzgibbons was working. Now the man returned to the truck, and he waited, standing outside the open cab door. Through the window shield she could see that 2 more men sat in the front seat, and that one wore horn-rimmed glasses. That reminds me of the doctor. Now Mr. Fitzgibbon approached the truck, Billy dancing beside him, apparently in some excitement. There was a conference, none of which Mrs. Frisby could hear, accompanied by gestures toward the rosebush and the waiting bulldozer. The man in the white coat climbed back into the driver's seat and drove the truck across the grass. He backed it up beside the bulldozer, stopping perhaps 10 feet from the bush. Mrs. Frisby stared at it. If there was anything printed on it, it must have been on the other side, away from her. Then 3 men climbed out, and she could hear what they said. "It's a big one, all right," said one of the men. "And look at those thorns. It's hard to see how even a rat could get in there." The man in the horned rim walked around the edge of the bush, examining it closely. He bent over. "Hey, look at this," he said. "There's an entrance hole, a very neatly hidden one. And look behind it. It's a path leading in." He turned to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had walked with Billy. "You were right. You'll need to bulldoze it. It would take us all day to hack away there. But cut it off just at the surface, if you can. If we dig too deep and open up a hole, they're all going to get away." He added, "You better tell the boy to keep back. We'll be using cyanide. It's going to be very dangerous." Billy, after some argument, was dispatched back to the back porch, where Mrs. Fitzgibbon was also watching. One of the men had walked around to the far side of the bush, the side near Mrs. Frisby's tree. "Doc," he called, Here's another entrance in the bush. And hey, look, there's a hole just inside it. Doc, was the man in the horn-rimmed glasses? He was the doctor? Mrs. Frisby thought. Doctor somebody. He was in charge for sure. Can you get at it? Said the man in the horn-rimmed glasses. Not very well. There's too many thorns. The man who was the doctor walked around and looked at it. No, he said. Anyway, that would be the escape hatch. We'll find the main hole near the middle of the bush. He turned to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had mounted the tractor. Okay, said the doctor. Can you push it that way, away from the shed? Mr. Fitzgibbon nodded, and the motor started up with a roar. He pulled the lever and flexed the heavy steel blade up and down, bringing the bottom edge to rest even with the ground. The blade was fully 8 feet across. He pulled another lever. The wheels, with cleated tires as tall as windows, dug in, and the blade scraped forward. The bush fought back, then yielded angrily, snapping and cracking before the thrust of the steel blade. A single sweep, and in a third there it lay, a writhing heap of thorns in a pile 20 feet away. The ground trembled under the wheels, and Mrs. Frisby thought of the 10 rats huddled below. Supposing the weight had collapsed the earth, caved in the storage room, and trapped them. Another sweep, and a third. Only a thorny stubble now stood where the bush had been. On the porch, Mrs. Fitzgibbon covered her eyes with her hands, and Billy cheered with excitement. Plainly exposed were 2 holes, simple round rat holes. There was no trace of the small mound, nor the elegant arched entranceway. Arthur had done his work thoroughly. Mrs. Frisby wondered for a moment at the second hole. Then she remembered him saying, We'll give them another rear exit to block, of course. They had dug another hole, most likely, she thought, just a dummy one leading nowhere at all. The men in the white suits went into action. The back of the truck opened up and a long, flexible tube unrolled. It looked kind of like a fire hose, except that at the end, instead of a nozzle, there was a round plunger like a big rubber ball cut in half. One of the men donned a mask with a glass visor and the tube that ran to a pack on his back. It must have been a gas mask. The masked man pulled the hose over the center of the rat hole and pressed the plunger over it, covering it completely. From the back of the truck, the other two took a large box made of wood and wire, almost a yard wide, and placed it over the second hole. Oh my, it was a cage, but half of its bottom was a trap door neatly mounted on hinges. This they raised, placing the open part directly over the opening in the earth. Then they backed away, one of them holding a tripcord which would close the trapdoor after the rats were inside. All set? The doctor called the man in the mask. The masked man nodded. Keep back now, keep back, said the doctor to the Fitzgibbons, to Mr. Fitzgibbon, who had left his tractor to watch. He walked to the truck, reached inside, and turned a switch. Mrs. Frisby heard a soft thump and a pump. Now, she turned and watched the blackberry bramble in the woods. Would they hear the pump? Where were they? Oh, let them come out. Almost a minute passed. The men in white watched the trap. Nothing moved. And then she saw it. Behind the bramble, half hidden by a swirl of mist, a gray-brown shape, a rat, shaking dirt from his ears. Another. Then there were 3 more. They huddled in silence, waiting. More? How many? 10? 7? Only 7? Where were the others? Still they waited. Then, as if by agreement, they stopped waiting. They ran, all 7 of them, not back into the woods to the safety, but out of the woods toward the stubble of the rosebush toward the men. At the edge of the bush they stopped as if in confusion, ran to the left, then ran to the right, then fled back into the woods again. And now they were out of sight of the men, but not of Mrs. Frisby. Instantly they regrouped behind the blackberry bramble and charged out again, but this time in smaller numbers. First 2 of them, then 3 of them, then 2 of them. She saw what they were up to. They were not in the least confused. They were making 7 rats look like 20 rats or 40 rats instead of a stream of them. and in the midst, in the hectic turning and running and turning and hiding, she could not tell whether or not she recognized any of those rats. The men shouted, "Hey, look at that! Oh, there's a whole pack of them!" "Oh my gosh, how did they get out? Get the nets, quick!" The doctor turned off the pump. The man with the hose pulled off his mask. As a new wave of rats danced along the edge of the clearing, all three men ran to the truck and from it pulled long-handled nets. But Mrs. Frisby, up on her branch, was staring at the blackberry bush again. She saw something that all of the others, including the rats, did not see. An eighth rat had come out. He emerged running, and then he stumbled. He got up and ran again, this time more slowly, circling vaguely to the right. He did not seem to know where he was going. He reached a sparse thicket of saplings almost out of sight, and there abruptly he fell over on his side, and he lay very still. Meanwhile, all three men, holding their nets low, ran across the stubble toward the parade of rats. But as they approached the parade, it vanished. The rats, their purpose accomplished, melted away into the misty woods, and this time they did not reappear. Mrs. Frisby watched them as they loped away swiftly in single file and disappeared from her view back into the deep forest and up into the mountainside. The rear guard was gone, bound for Thorn Valley. But the eighth rat still lay unmoving among the saplings, and two had never come out at all. "Oh, my goodness, they're gone," said the man who had worn the mask. "Gosh darn it, they fooled us." "What happened?" asked Mr. Fitzgibbon, standing near the truck. "Simple enough," said the doctor. "They had two escape holes, and they used the other one." He walked back to the blackberry bramble and bent down, kicking the branches aside with his foot. "Here it is," he said. "Quite a long tunnel. One of the longest that I've ever seen." The other two men, he said, "Get the pick and the shovels." For half an hour they dug, laying open a narrow trench along the tunnel. From his angle of view in the tree, From her angle of view in the tree, Mrs. Frisby could see only the top of this trench, and not down into the bottom. Still she watched, saying to herself, perhaps, after all, there were only 8. Maybe there were only 8. Maybe they decided that 8 would be enough. Then one of the shovels broke through into the air. They had come to the rats' storage room. "There's 2 of them," said one of the men, and her heart sank. Oh, no, who were they? She wanted to run and look, but she did not. "Careful," said the doctor. "There may be some gas in there. Let the wind blow it out." "Phew," said one of the men. "That's not gas. That's garbage." "Open it up a little," said the doctor. One of the men wielded a shovel for another minute, and then the doctor peered in. "Garbage," he said. "It's last night's dinner. Garbage and 2 dead rats." Mrs. Frisby thought. "Only 2?" said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Yes, it's easy to see what happened. In a hole this size, there would have been a couple dozen at least, but these 2 must have been up in the front, near the tunnel. They got a whiff of that gas and it killed them. But before they died, they must have warned the others, so the rest ran out." "Warned them?" said Mr. Fitzgibbons. "Could they do that?" "Yep," said the doctor. "They're intelligent animals, those rats. Some can do a great deal more than that." But he did not elaborate. Instead, he turned to one of the men. "Well, we might as well take these 2 back with us." From the truck, the man produced a white paper sack and a pair of plastic gloves. He pulled the gloves on, reached into the hole, and placed the 2 dead rats into a sack. He did this with his back to Mrs. Frisby, so that she never got a good glimpse of them. "All right," said the doctor. "Let's close it on up." They shoveled the dirt back into the trench, and they returned to the truck. "You'll let me know if those rats there have rabies," said Mr. Fitzgibbons. "Rabies?" said the doctor. Oh, yes, we'll see. Of course, but we don't think they have rabies. They look perfectly healthy to us." "Perfectly healthy," thought Mrs. Frisby sadly, "except for being dead." She looked into the woods, over toward the saplings where the other rat lay. Was he too now dead? To her surprise, she saw that he was moving. Or was he? In the mist it was hard to tell, but something had moved. After the truck had left, Mr. Fitzgibbon stood looking at the ruin of the rosebush. He seemed vaguely puzzled and a little disappointed. He must be wondering, she thought, whether it had been worth it all, just to exterminate 2 rats. He had no way of knowing, of course, that all the rest were also gone, and that they would never return again. That his grain loft was safe now. In a moment he turned and walked to the house. As soon as he was safely gone, Mrs. Frisby scurried down from the tree and into the woods. On the ground she could no longer see the rat or the thicket where he lay, but she knew the direction, and so she ran toward it, and around the stump, over a mound of leaves, past a cedar tree. There were the saplings, and there lay the rat, still on his side. Oh my, it was Brutus. Beside him, futilely trying to move him, stood Mr. Ages. She reached him breathless from her run. Is he dead? No, no, no. He's just unconscious. But he's alive, still breathing. I think he'll revive if I can just get him to swallow this. Mr. Ages indicated a small cork bottle, no bigger than a thimble, on the ground beside him. What is it? An antidote to the poison. We thought if this might happen, so we got it ready last night. He got just a little of the gas, made it this far, and then collapsed. Help me lift his head. Help me. Mr. Ages had been unable to lift Brutus's head and the bottle at the same time. Now, with Mrs. Frisby's help, he forced open Brutus's mouth and poured in just a few drops of the smoky liquid that the bottle contained. And in a few seconds Brutus made a gulping noise, swallowed hard, and spoke. It's dark, he said. I can't see. Well, open your eyes, said Mr. Ages. Brutus opened them and looked around. I'm out, he said. Oh my gosh, how did I get here? Don't you remember? No. Wait. Yes, I was in the hole. I smelled gas, an awful choking sweet smell. I tried to run, but I stumbled over somebody lying on the floor, and I fell down. I must have breathed some gas. I couldn't get up. And then I heard the others running past me. I couldn't see them. It was darker than night. Then one of them ran into me and stopped. He pulled me up. I tried to run again, but I was too dizzy. I kept on falling. The other one helped me up again, and I went a few more steps. He kept pulling me and then pushing. Somehow, finally, I got to the end of the tunnel. I saw daylight, and the air smelled better, but there was nobody else there. I thought the others must have left, so I ran a little farther, and, that's all I remember, Mrs. Frisby said. What about the one who helped you? I don't know. I don't know who it was. I couldn't see. He didn't speak at all. I suppose he was trying to hold his own breath. When we got near the end, I could see daylight. He gave me one last shove toward, and then he turned back. Oh, he went back? Yes, you see, there was still one rat back there, the one I stumbled over. I think he went back to help that one. Whoever he was, said Mrs. Frisby, they never came out. He died in there. Whoever he was, said Mr. Ages, he surely was brave. And that is the end of the chapter. And now we have an epilogue. It's just a couple of pages. But can you suppose who those 2 rats could have been? I'm wondering if it was Nicodemus. I am going to be so sad. Perhaps it was Arthur. We will see. Epilogue. An epilogue is the ending to a story, and tells you a little bit that happens after the story has ended. Now, a few days later, early in the morning, the plow came through the garden. Mrs. Frisby heard the chug of the tractor and the soft scrape of the steel against the earth. She watched from just inside her front door, fearfully at first, but then with growing confidence. The owl and the rats had calculated wisely, and the nearest furrow was more than 2 feet from her house. Behind the plow, in the moist and the shining soil, the rudely upturned red-brown earthworms writhed with a frenzy to rebury themselves in the dirt. Hopping along each furrow was a flock of spring robins, as they tried to catch the worms before they slid out of sight. And when the plow was done, and the worms had all disappeared, either eaten or safely underground, Mr. Fitzgibbon came back with the harrow, breaking down the furrows or the big clumps of dirt, and turned them all up again. It was a good day for the robins. They had a lot to eat. After the harrow, for the next 2 days came the Fitzgibbons themselves, all four of them, with hoes and bags of seeds, and planting lettuce and beans and spinach and potatoes and corn and mustard greens. Mrs. Frisby and her family kept out of sight. Thoughtfully, Brutus and Arthur had dug their doorway behind the tuft of grass so that not even Billy noticed that they were there. Now Brutus and Arthur, Mrs. Frisby did not suppose she would ever see either of them again, nor would she see Nicodemus, nor any of the other rats. Brutus, after swallowing Mr. Age's medicine and resting for half an hour, had gone on his way into the forest to join the colony in Thorn Valley. There was no talk of their coming back unless their attempt to grow their own food should fail, and she did not believe that that would happen. They were too smart for that, and even if they did fail, they would probably not come back to Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm. She thought it would be pleasant to visit them and see their new home, their small lake and their crops growing, but she had no idea where the valley was, and it would be, in any case, too long a journey for her and her children. She could only wonder about them. Were they, at that moment, like the Fitzgibbons, planting seeds behind their own plough? Some, like Isabella's mother's, might grumble about the hardness of the new life that they had chosen. Yet the story of what had happened to Jenner and his friends, if it was Jenner and his friends, to say nothing of the destruction of their own home, would surely help to convince them that Nicodemus's ideas were right. The Fitzgibbons finished their planting, and for a week or two all was quiet, but it would not stay that way, for the crops would appear and the asparagus was ready to sprout, and for the rest of the spring and summer the garden would be too busy a place for mice to live in. So on a day in May, on a warm summer day, early in the morning, Mrs. Frisby and her children laid a patchwork of sticks, grass, and leaves over the top of the entrance to their cinder block house, and then they carefully scraped earth over it so that it would not show. With luck, they would not have to dig a new one in the fall. They walked to their summer house, taking half a day to do it, strolling slowly and enjoying the fine weather, stopping on the way to eat some new spring leaves of field cress, some young poke grass, and a crisp, spicy mushroom that had sprouted by the edge of the woods. For the main course, a little farther on, there was a whole field of winter wheat, its kernels newly ripe and soft. And as they approached the brook toward the big tree in the hollow, of whose roots they would make their summer home, the children ran ahead, shouting and laughing. Timothy ran with them, and Mrs. Frisby was glad to see that he showed no trace of illness. It was an exciting time for them. In the garden they were always alone with themselves, but among the bank of the brook in the summer lived 5 other field mice families, all with children. Within a few minutes of arrival, her 4 had gone with a group of others down to the water to see the tadpoles swimming. Mrs. Frisby set about the job of tidying up her house, which had acquired a carpet of dead leaves during the winter, and then bringing a pile of soft green moss to serve as bedding for them all. The house was a roomy chamber with a pleasant earthy smell. Its floor was hard-packed dirt, and its wooden roof was arched, intertwining with roots, above which rose the tree itself, an oak tree. And on her way to get the moss, she saw one of her neighbors, a lady mouse named Janice, who, like herself, had 4 children. Janice ran over to talk to her. "You're so late getting here," she said. "We all thought something must have happened." "No," said Mrs. Frisby, "we're all fine." "But don't you live in the garden?" Janice persisted. "I should have thought that you would have been afraid of the plowing." "Well, as a matter of fact," Mrs. Frisby explained, "they didn't plow the particular spot in the garden where we live. It's behind a boulder." "Oh, my, you're so lucky." "Why, that's true." More than that Mrs. Frisby did not tell. She'd agreed to keep her secret, and she would do just as she had said. Still, she thought after quite a long deliberation, it was probably all right to tell her children, first making them promise to keep it a secret. They were, after all, the children of Jonathan Frisby. For all she knew, and all Nicodemus knew, they were likely to turn out to be quite different from all the other mice, and they did have a right to know the reason why. The following evening, therefore, when they had finished the early supper, she gathered them around. Children, I have a story to tell you. It's a long one. Oh, good, cried Cynthia. What kind of a story? It's a true one. It's about your father and about the rats. Well, how can it be about father and the rats? Teresa asked. Because he was a friend of theirs. He was? Said Martin. I never knew that. Well, it was mostly before you were born. To everyone's surprise, Timothy said, I thought he might be. I think Mr. H's was a friend of theirs, too. Well, how did you know that? Well, I didn't know it, I just thought it. A couple of times I saw Mr. H's leaving their rose bush, and I knew that Father used to visit him quite a lot. But I never saw him near the rose bush. Probably, Mrs. Frisby thought, because he would have been careful always to leave through the blackberry bramble, just so we would not see him. They sat down outside the entrance to the house, and beginning at the very beginning, with her first visit to the rats, she told them all that she had seen and done, and all that Nicodemus had told her. It took a long time to tell it, and as she talked, the sun sank low, turning the sky from red to lighting the tops of the mountains, beyond which, somewhere out there, the rats of NIMH were living. The children's eyes grew round when she told them about the escape from NIMH, and even rounder when she described her own capture and escape from the birdcage. But in the end, the eyes of Teresa and Cynthia were filled with tears, and Martin and Timothy looked sad. Teresa said, But Mother, that's terrible. It must have been Justin. He saved Brutus, and then he went back. Oh, he was so nice. Mrs. Frisby said, It might have been Justin. We can't be for sure. I couldn't tell. It could have been one of them or the other. Martin said, Well, I'm going to find out. I'm going to go to the Thorn Valley some day. Somehow I'm going to go. But it's too far, and you don't know where it is. No, but I'll bet Jeremy knows. Remember, he told you the rats had a clearing back in the hills. That must be Thorn Valley. He thought about this for a minute, and then he added, He might even, fly me there on his back, the way he did you. But we don't know where Jeremy is either. We don't see the crows down here, Mrs. Frisby reminded him. No, but in the fall, when we go back to the garden, I could find him then. If I got something shiny and put it out in the sun, why, he'd come right to get it. Martin was growing excited with the idea. Oh, Mother, may I please go? Oh, my, I don't know. I doubt the rats will want visitors from the outside. Oh, they wouldn't mind. After all, you helped them, and so did Father, and I wouldn't do any harm. It's not something we have to decide tonight, said Mrs. Frisby. I'll think about it. And now it's late, my children. It's time for bed. The sun had set, and they went into the house, and they lay down on the soft moss that Mrs. Frisby had placed on the floor of their room under the roots. Outside, the brook swam quietly through the woods, and up above them, the warm wind blew through the newly opened leaves of the big oak tree, and they all went to sleep. And that, my sweet children, is the end of the story of Mrs. Frisby and the rats of NIMH. I am so curious. Today I am going to have you write and tell me who you think those rats were and why. And do you think that Martin will ever, and Timothy and maybe some of the other children, do you think they will ever again see the rats of NIMH? Let me know what you think. And also, please rate the book on a scale from 1 to 5. Did you like it? 1 being, it was not very good. 2, it's all right. 3, I thought it was okay. 4, I liked it quite a bit. 5, I thought it was fabulous. Rate the book from 1 to 5, and then we will share it out. We will also have a writing assignment about this next week. We're going to be talking a little bit about this book, and we're going to be talking about the plan. Why would the rats want to live in an area where they didn't have all the great technology that made their lives so easy? Anyway, that is for another day. I love you all. I am so happy to see you today. Can't believe today is Wednesday. And then we have 2 days until market day. I love you. Have a fabulous day. I'll talk with you soon.